Look, thank you. It's a privilege to be here on Ngunnawal country speaking to you today. When I got the brief, or when I got the invitation to speak at this meeting, I interpreted my brief as a request to unpack a little bit the question of what consumers say they're willing to pay to support natural capital, and then understand why there's a gap between what people might say when an economist or a sociologist sends them a survey instrument and when they actually go to the supermarket or the farmer's market or an online provider and actually spend their money. And I'm still going to try and do that, but in a really compressed way, because I also want to respond to the other speakers and to the Minister, who yesterday morning raised two issues in relation to one aspect of natural capital, that being biodiversity conservation. And the Minister mentioned the idea of a national certification scheme, which certainly speaks to that issue of whether or not certification of environmental care, in this case through biodiversity conservation, will actually generate any kind of change in consumer behaviour or willingness to pay. But the Minister also spoke about the idea of payments, which means that in a sense all of us would be paying for the conservation, but we'd be doing it through the tax system with the government acting as our representative. So two different, although the way they may be experienced for the primary producer might be relatively similar, but two quite different ways through which we might be effectively putting our money where our mouths are. So just firstly on this issue of willingness to pay. Now, there's different ways you can measure willingness to pay, and they'll all come up with an answer. Probably what's more important is what you can unpack from that data in terms of what kind of people say more or less, because there's not much correlation between what people say and then what you actually see out in the market. So, the most obvious example for most people would be organic certification, because it's something that's very visible and very visibly attracts a market premium. It's a while since I've done it. Last time, probably about 10 years ago, a team I was involved in took a look at what the actual retail price premiums were in Australia. They weren't the 30% that you typically see in the literature. They were quite variable across the cities and regions of Australia, but closer to 80 to 100%. Yet when you ask people about willingness to pay a premium, they say 20%. So in that case, people are clearly paying a lot more than they say they'll be willing to. And yet I bet if you ask the same people a question worded something like the Minister just announced a national biodiversity certification scheme, how much more would you be willing to pay? They'd probably say 20%. And they probably wouldn't pay anything in reality. That'd be my punt. And the reason I'd take that punt, I'm going to ignore most of my, there. I'm going straight to the last slide. But I'm still going to annoy the chair and go over time. I reckon PowerPoint must be the biggest constraint on innovative thinking at scientific and professional meetings. So scattered around this diagram, don't worry about what the axes mean at the moment, but scattered around the diagram are different kinds of standards that are quite common in the market at the moment. And some of those, like organic and fair trade standards, are accompanied by price premiums. Others, such as business-to-business standards, good agricultural practice standards, the many variants on those that probably cover now more agricultural produce than any other standard, they don't come with a market premium. They come with better access. They come, as Stewart said, it's good to not be on a panel of manels, usually my fear coming to these meetings, it's a very bad look for a professor of sociology, is to be on an all-male panel. But to be on a half Stewart panel doesn't seem too bad. It comes with risk. It's a risk management tool. It helps facilitate market access. Does it help facilitate better environmental practice? Well, I could spend hours talking about that because I've got a lot of doubts about most GAP standards. But nonetheless, they don't necessarily provide a financial premium. They help manage that risk. Now, I wanted to get on so there's a couple of things I want to say quickly just about why there's often a gap between what consumers say they'll do and what consumers actually do. It's the classic attitude behaviour split in the literature. And it all comes down to things, you know, I could dump the sociological jargon on you, even worse, the psychological jargon, but it really comes down to things that will be very familiar to you. We all have lots of competing priorities, lots of things we take into consideration when we're sourcing food or other, agriculturally oriented or derived products. We don't have unlimited resources. We don't necessarily trust every source of information. We're often sceptical about labels, and we're limited in where we apply trust. And besides all of that, most of what we do doesn't happen through rational cognition. It happens through routine and habituation. And that's not a bad thing. It can be a bad thing. It means changing consumer behaviour can be extremely hard. So you get this inertia around behaviour. But in physics, inertia and momentum are the same thing. Exactly the same thing. It's just a different perspective. It also means that when you have positive behaviours, however they're judged, it also means that they can be sticky. You can get some sustainability in that behaviour. So if you're trying to influence a behaviour to become more sustainable or more beneficial to your business, and you can nudge consumer behaviour in that direction, it tends to be sticky. Another point to derive from these standards, of course, which is very relevant to understanding consumer behaviour, is that most of these are not visible to consumers. Most of the time, you're not selling to consumers and they're not purchasing from you. There's all sorts of intermediaries. The big retailers currently dominate supply chains. Maybe with online businesses, the nature of that big of retail is changing. But for the most part, the influential buyers here are retailers. And British retailers think about this issue around routine and habituation in an interesting way. They talk about choice editing. They talk about how important it is to make it easy for people to choose the right thing. Now, of course, you might be sceptical. What's a British supermarket going to say is the right thing? It's probably going to be something that's in their own financial interest. But it's also because they're trying to manage their own social risk, their own business risk. It's also around helping people make choices that they think are going to be more socially and environmentally responsible. So they're looking to make that easy, to make consumer choice easy, to break through that inertia and create what for them is a positive momentum. Now, before I run out of time, clock says I'm already very close. I want to talk about the payments and just raise a few issues around it. I'm not a skeptic around offering payments for environmental or social services, but I am skeptical about the way these things are often applied as a bit of a silver bullet. And if I have one message about this idea about issuing payments for biodiversity conservation or other environmental values, it would be not to throw out all the other instruments that we've experimented with, particularly things around catchment management, regional resource management and land care, which are all about getting people together. Because without those things working together and aligning the financial incentives with people's ability to get together and negotiate, I don't think either system is likely to work very well. So just a few things around making payments. I'll do a very irritating academic thing and refer to a book that I've just published. Currently, the only people who've read it are me, my wife, and my publisher. So, here's a chance to be on the cutting edge. But in that book, what I try and do is look at a lot of these financial instruments and just look at what we've learnt from experience to date, and identify not so much some design principles, but identify a range of factors that ought to be taken into account. So just mentioning a few of those in relation to making payments for biodiversity or other ecosystem services. The first is that biodiversity is a really complex thing. Biodiversity is not going to be conserved by putting fences around a few bits of remnant vegetation. Right? And because of its complexity, it's very difficult to manage through an exclusively market-based instrument unless that instrument gets incredibly complicated. And the more complicated they get, the less they look more like a market and the more they look like top-down regulation. So very careful design and consideration to what can and can't be achieved is important. The spatial and the temporal continuity of the conservation is really important. I think Stewart and Wendy both mentioned the need for long-term investment. The other issue with biodiversity is spatial connection. You know, isolated pockets of remnant native vegetation are not likely to be particularly resilient, particularly under changing climate dynamics. That takes me to another point, which I think we need to start taking into consideration, don't really address in the book, but which I think will be important, which is the importance of really deliberate active management to conserve biodiversity, given changing climate dynamics. I'm involved in a separate research program around assisted ecosystem adaptation in the Great Barrier Reef. This is an incredibly complex and scientifically and ethically fraught area. But locking things up is not going to keep our biodiversity in a sustainable state over a long-term period. There's risk of perverse impacts. Some of the pilot schemes that have been undertaken within Australia point towards a bit of a lack of additionality. In other words, people are getting paid to do things that they would have done in any case. So there needs to be care to make sure that we're actually getting extra bang for their buck. The point within the bigger chart here was to say that sometimes we need to have a bit of a conversation about how much landholders are actually responsible for and where it's appropriate to offer additional assistance. I think one of the biggest perverse impacts of the Common Agricultural Policy has been to drive everything into the bottom left quadrant of this diagram, where everything environmental is seen as a public good and something that landholders have no responsibility for, which is obviously a level of oversimplification that's quite at odds with Wendy's introduction to this topic. And the last point I'll make here, because I'm way over time, is to talk a bit about the social diversity and the landscape diversity of rural Australia. It's absolutely true. Agriculture covers half the Australian landmass. Farmers are really important in stewarding our natural resources. You know, without active management and people living in the landscape, actively managing the landscape, is not going to be sustainable. We also have other major land users. There is a distinct lack of representation at these kind of meetings of Aboriginal Australia. Now, it's hard to get an exact figure. About 38% of Australia is currently covered by some kind of native title tenure. Much of that overlaps with the conservation estate. Much of it also overlaps with the agricultural estate. There's also very significant tracts of land that are owned privately by Aboriginal pastoral companies and other Indigenous businesses. These are really important stakeholders. I absolutely welcome the underlying idea in the Minister's message that rural Australia needs a diversified economy that produces agricultural value, environmental value, social and cultural value. And to do that, particularly the environmental and the social and cultural value, we need to think beyond agriculture, which means involving public land managers, conservation land managers. It also means involving the overlapping interest, which is the Indigenous land managers. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.